Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to recognize Ms. Bonamici. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some specific questions, but first I want to point out a couple of fundamental big picture issues I think that we can use when we frame this conversation. The first is education a public good or a commodity? And the second is, are we going to eliminate or further blur the difference between education and job training? Both important, but not the same. I also want to challenge the notion that was brought up earlier in this hearing that for some reason diversity, equity, and inclusion might not be relevant to preparing students for the real world of work. And I want to dispute that because DEI programs are often used, for example, for first-generation students, for veterans with PTSD, for students with disabilities. Also, DEI programs can help, here's a great explanation, encourage critical thinking, help students learn to communicate effectively with people of varied backgrounds, which I suggest people in this building could benefit from as well. So I want to push back on the notion that they're somehow not related to preparing people for the real world. I want to follow up on Representative Grothman's question to you, Dr. Gillen. You have a paper in which you wrote that state disinvestment in higher education is, you called it, a myth. So, Dr. Gillen, do you agree that the word disinvestment in this context means reduction of financial resources?
Yeah, in the conventional wisdom, yeah.
Right, okay. So in 2022, 28 states provided less funding per students at state universities than they did in 2008. 10 of those states funded higher education at least 20% below 2008 levels. So if we go back a little further to 2001, 36 states have reduced their level of funding in today's dollars. So these states clearly reduced their investments in higher education in the past 20 years. So if 36 states have reduced their funding of public universities in inflation-adjusted dollars, doesn't this meet the disinvestment definition?
So 2001 was before this year, it was the peak funding, and you generally don't want to kind of compare a peak to some other random. Well,
my point is that many states have disinvested, and from 2008 to 2018, four-year public college tuition rose on average 38% in inflation-adjusted dollars. And your research claims that there's no direct relationship between this disinvestment by states and increases to tuition. And I strongly disagree with that, particularly as a former state legislator. The research from the Nonpartisan State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, SHEO, shows the opposite. They found a direct correlation between decreasing education revenue and tuition. So according to SHEO, the student share of an institution's revenue increased from 28.9% to 42%, excluding federal stimulus funding. So this is what the report said: due to declines in education appropriations and net tuition revenue increases. This data clearly shows that colleges relied on tuition revenue increases to recoup losses suffered by declines in state funding. So again, I served in the state legislature. I saw universities forced to raise their tuition after state disinvestment. Right now, at the beginning of this year, my state was number 39 out of 50. So I just want to make clear that your data may be hurting students, institutions, and taxpayers who rely on state funding to support our strong higher education system. So Dr. Cellini, why is it important to address state disinvestment? Why should that be part of what we're talking about to discuss issues of cost to students and institutions? And how do claims of disinvestment hurt students, institutions, and taxpayers?
Yeah, well, we know that states are primarily responsible for funding community colleges, which are very low-cost institutions that have generally, on average,
I'm a community college graduate myself.
Better earnings outcomes than programs in, for example, the for-profit sector. So my own research has shown that the earnings gains in community college programs are much higher than the earnings gains in for-profit programs for similar students, looking at similar students with similar prior earnings. So we know that those are great investments and low-cost options for students.
Thank you, Dr. Cellini. I want to agree with Ranking Member Scott that oftentimes there's value that cannot be assessed or measured in higher education. I want to make clear I do not agree with with the notion that whether a student got a good education should be measured by their postgraduate earnings. If someone joins the Peace Corps, or works for a nonprofit organization, they're not going to, or becomes a teacher, they're not necessarily going to have high earnings, but they're doing incredibly valuable work. that does not mean that they did not get a good education. That being said, Dr. Cellini, you talked about imperfect information. I support the bicameral, bipartisan College Transparency Act. So how can federal policy makers better promote communication of outcomes data that is privacy protected and includes multiple measures of student success, including completion rates? Are there successful examples that either in the public or private sectors that we could model when it comes to good consumer information?
Well, I'll mention that in the new gainful employment proposal by the Department of Ed, there's a new requirement to have information available on high debt, low earning programs that students will need to acknowledge. And this is across beyond just the non-degree programs and career training programs.
Thank you. I'm being gabbled down, so I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sorry.